Hi, I'm Carl Franklin. In this episode of Blazor Train, we're going to dive into binding, the secret sauce that associates parts of your user interface to variables in your application. And for this episode, I've invited my friend Joel Hewlin to the party. Joel has lots of experience with JavaScript frameworks, but is at heart a C# developer. And you'll see his reaction to the wonderfully webby world of Blazor binding. And that's coming up right now, right here on Blazor Train. Blazor Train! Blazor is a single-page application user interface framework for the web. Just like Vue, React, Angular, and of course Knockout, one of the very first popular UI frameworks, which was written by Steve Sanderson, the man responsible for Blazor. The main function of a UI framework is to bridge the gap between what the app does and how the user interacts with the app, the user interface. Before these UI frameworks came on the scene, web developers did everything manually, making AJAX calls to servers to get bits of data and then updating the UI elements one by one as they needed to change. And that strategy works well until your app grows in size and more DOM elements become dependent on each other. The key to reducing the manual work you do as a developer is, you guessed it, binding. Binding is how you can associate variables with DOM elements. You can bind any variable to any property or attribute of any DOM element. Once bound, you only have to change the variables to update the UI. Now, I know this idea is rudimentary for most of my viewers. However, I feel it's important to explain the big picture for those who may be new to web programming and UI frameworks. As I said earlier, I've invited a super smart friend of mine, Joel Hewlin, to get his reaction as he sees how binding is done in Blazor for the first time. Let's watch. Okay, this is going to be so awesome because I'm here with my friend and fellow AppVNext engineer, Joel Hewlin. Hey, Joel.
Hey, Carl.
Now, I asked you to be here because I wanted somebody to see Blazor binding who's never seen it before. And you haven't, right?
I have not, no.
Do you know anything about Blazor, actually?
I know that it's basically C# in the browser.
Yeah.
Which sounds awesome, but also a little bit weird.
Right. And so let's set the tone for our viewers in terms of your experience as a developer. From what I know of you, you are a full stack developer. You've done UI stuff in CSS, in JavaScript, lots of JavaScript. Yep. You've done backend stuff. In fact, you've done work for Microsoft, right? On their documentation for Azure Labs and things like that, right? And you've worked with other companies as well. So what UI frameworks in JavaScript have you actually worked with?
I mean, I've worked with vanilla JavaScript ever since the late 90s, early 2000s. I remember the days of trying to get dynamic stuff to work back then. Right. Moved into jQuery just like everybody else when it was cool, and then Knockout when that seemed cool for a while. And then, the more modern frameworks, I did use Angular for a little bit and played around with React, but really, I mean, lately my last several projects has been with Vue, Vue.js.
All right.
And I like the simplicity of it.
Cool. And I know you're working a lot with Soliance, with Michelle and Brian and those guys there, and working through them for Microsoft. So I think you're really qualified to have an opinion as someone who's done, as you said, Knockout, Angular, React, Vue. You've done all these JavaScript UI frameworks, and you don't necessarily have to be an expert to know how to compare this new component model for binding to what you have already seen, right?
Yeah, that sounds fair.
All right, cool. Well, just because you may have not seen the demo of Blazor, when you create a Blazor application, there can be two. You have a choice of a server-side Blazor app or a WebAssembly Blazor app. The server-side runs in the server. WebAssembly runs in the browser. This is a server-side Blazor app.
Okay.
All right. So essentially, the canonical demo is the counter, right? You've got this click me button.
Very impressive.
Oh, yeah. It's so impressive. And all of my viewers and people who know me are totally sick of the counter by this point.
Yeah.
All right. So what we're going to do is show some binding. So I'm going to just get rid of all the stuff in the default page, the index page. I'm going to replace it with this. So, yeah. So here we have this message, which is a private string. It's a string property, and it's just set to two-way bound message. And all I'm doing for a one-way binding is just using the @Razor syntax to just put that wherever I want in the HTML.
Okay.
Okay.
So basically, if I can interrupt you here, this is not a typical kind of template like you would see in the JavaScript framework. For instance, Vue would be a .vue page where you've got, it's an HTML-based DOM template, which this seems more like. It's definitely not like a React JSX page, which is basically XML. Right. So you're just using Razor syntax here for your one-way.
Razor syntax, yeah.
Okay.
It's all Razor syntax, and this same code is going to work equally well on the server and in the client. There isn't any difference in the code block that that you need to do. There isn't any plumbing code that you need to do if it's on the client or if it's on the server. It just works. They've got magic in there that with SignalR that makes it all work, and I've gone through all that stuff. But
it uses SignalR.
Yeah, the server-side version uses SignalR to automatically hook the DOM elements and communicate with the server. The server then looks at the DOM graph that it has of the client DOM in memory, and it runs the code and applies it. And then any differences it sends back in these tight binary messages through SignalR that gets hooked in their JavaScript and then updates the DOM. So
interesting.
Yeah, so it's basically doing Ajax for you automatically.
Right. Over WebSockets.
Over SignalR, yeah. So this message could be a property of an object that you create. Right? It doesn't, it could be, you could use the view model idea if you want to, and access the properties of those objects. This is just for simplification. That is the simplest way to do one-way binding in Blazor.
All right.
So your reaction so far relative to, let's say, Angular?
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, Angular, there's so much ceremony involved, right? Like, you could not do this with this few lines of code in one page in Angular. And I guess the question is, the thing that you kind of fall into with these JavaScript frameworks is sort of your dependency hell, for lack of a better term. You've got all these NPM packages and things that all need to load up in order to even begin. And so what does that look like here?
Yeah, that's a good point. So all that we've done, Joel, is we've taken the default template, right? And we've just changed the index page to this code right here. That's it.
Nice.
So there's no other dependencies other than what's in the template.
It's very clean. That's why I've switched to Vue, because I like the cleanliness of it, for lack of a better term. It's less ceremony involved. So this is very much down that path.
Okay.
All right.
So now let's get to two-way binding. So we've got an input tag here, and we're using the @bind syntax to bind, and we haven't specified a property to bind to, and so therefore it's going to bind this message to the default property of input, which is value.
Okay.
All right. So I could specify, if I want to,
Oh,
the property
interesting.
that I want to bind to just with a dash.
Okay. So you always prefix with at bind. Then
Yep.
you could do that. So you could maybe do like bind style or CSS or something like that too.
Well, I think that would be a different thing, but any property of that element you can bind to.
Okay.
Right? Okay, so let's run this again and see what happens when we change. Well, we haven't actually run it, have we? Let's run it for the first time and see what happens when we change the message. So I have a two-way bound message, and I'm going to type changed, and I have to trigger the change. And to do that, the default event, DOM event, that triggers that change and forces the update of that message is on changed.
On blur or on change?
Yeah, unblur, sort of same thing. On change, which is when it loses focus.
Okay.
So I'm going to hit the tab key. Ready? Boom.
Changed.
Changed.
Nice.
Okay. So far, so good. So what if I want to change the event to like a keystroke that forces the update? I can do that with @bind :event and set that to say on input. Okay.
Okay.
And so now every time I press a key, this with the contents of the value are going to update the message, which updates this label right here.
Interesting. Now, can you bind multiple events?
Let's just run this first, and then
Okay.
we'll take your questions. All right. So change on every key press.
Right.
All right. So
It really highlights your inability to spell. I like that.
you like that? Did I mess up?
No, you just you fixed it while you're typing.
Yeah, that's why I love editing. Yeah. All right. So there's one-way binding and two-way binding. Now, you were asking me a question.
Yes. Can you have multiple events in your bindings? So you have your on input. By default, it's on blur or on change.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't.
In other words, you want this?
Yeah, go ahead.
Right? You want to specify multiple events.
Right.
I do not think so.
Okay.
But I don't know. But I guarantee you, after we do this, I will research that and tell the police whether we can do it or not.
See, I was wondering how long it would take to come up with a question you don't know.
Yeah, well, there you go. Yeah.
Pretty good.
So what I would do is if I wanted to, I could hook another event, right? I could hook an event like on key press or on key up, right? And then I could say key up handler, and I could create a key up handler.
All right.
Like this. All right, now this is going to get, even though we still have this binding going on, this is going to get access on every key press. So let's do this. All right, so now we can look and see that args passed, the key is C. I don't know if you can see that, but the key that I pressed is C, and message is also C. So, yeah, so this is how you can hook events like you would in JavaScript. The difference is that you're using the @ syntax instead of just on key up.
Right. Which is similar to Vue also. When you're binding events, you can do that same kind of shortcut.
Right.
With the @. I like that.
Yeah, it's good. And, here's what, now you've done Knockout, right?
Yeah.
I did Knockout, when it came out and, had a brief stint with it after that. And I kind of like it, but you can definitely see that Steve Sanderson, who sort of Blazor is his brainchild, how he took all the things that he learned from building Knockout, and then he went to use Knockout to build out the Azure portal.
Yeah.
Right. So the Azure portal is built in Knockout with, under Steve Sanderson, he did it. So he used all of that knowledge and experience and put it into this Blazor component model. And you can really see how he's trying to just make it as simple as possible. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And the nice thing that I did like about Knockout is the fact that if you just want the binding, you don't have all the other framework stuff around it like you do with Angular.
Right.
So I'm wondering if there's some similarities to this. I guess that leads me to a question as to if you have an existing MVC application or Razor application,
yeah,
what does it take to Blazorify it?
All you really have to do is, and I'm going to do this in a upcoming episode of Blazor Train. All you really have to do is add the services, add the middleware, and then you can start adding Razor pages that have the Blazor component model that use it. So yeah, you just have to add a couple of files, and then you can add Blazor pages and components to existing MVC Razor applications.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I love that kind of approach. That's another, I keep coming back to Vue because, like I said, it's my current favorite of the week. But it's that same sort of thing. It allows you to do that sort of incremental adding of it into your existing project. So
yeah,
I love that.
Take over everything.
Okay, now we have to replumb everything.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So now I've also added a component, and I've done that just by right-clicking on the shared folder and saying add Razor component, and I've called it child component. So rather than just doing that for you, I'm going to show you what that looks like. So the people who have already gotten to this point in Blazor Train already know this, but every page is a component, but every component isn't necessarily a page. So a page is essentially a routable component. It's a component that you can get to with a URL route. Okay, but in essence, everything Blazor is a component. So here's a component called child component, and I've got a div with some inline styling, which you should never do, right?
Right.
Right. And I've got a parent message parameter here, and the parameter basically tells Blazor that this is a public bindable field, right?
Okay.
That we can set in the parent, and we can also get updates to in the parent.
It kind of reminds me of the old school user controls web form.
Yeah.
Remember those?
That's no accident. Yep.
Yep.
So there's a lot of goodness for ASP.NET Web Forms developers, and again, that's an upcoming episode of Blazor Train where I'm going to talk about that. But I want to show you what events look like. So I've defined an event. Now, you've done a lot of events in C#. You've got custom things that inherit from event args, and now you have to have an event, and you have to have delegates, and you have to do all this yada yada, right?
Yeah.
So look at this. Public event callback of string. In other words, that's what I'm passing back. Right? Message changed is the name of it. When I click this button, I'm calling update message. Update message sets our parent message to blaze on, and then we invoke message changed, which is our event, passing in parent message.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Follow me so far?
Yeah, I'm totally with you.
All right. So now we need to handle this event somehow. Now in your classic C# stuff, we would have, we would add a listener and have an event handler. Even in JavaScript, you'd add a listener, right? And then you'd have to remove the listener afterwards. All right, so let's do this. Let me change this code. Here's how we instantiate the child component and we set the parameters. We're binding the parent message property of the child component to our message property. And look at this. We're doing the event handling without an event handler. We're binding the parent message event that changes the parent message to message changed.
That's cool. Yeah, so it follows that exact same pattern of binding events, but now it has that special name there of that event.
Yeah.
I like that.
Doesn't that? Okay. And now what's going to happen is we still have our bind event on input for message. Mm-hmm. So I can still change it, here.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Now, because it's bound in the component I've got gray. Mm-hmm. Because it's bound in the component, it changes in the component. But if I want to change it from the component, boom.
Blazor.
Now it changes in the component, and because we're bound here through the event, we didn't even have to have an event handler. We just bound it and bound it by event. All right. So your reaction, sir?
Yeah. Again, the small amount of code and ceremony that's required is pretty amazing. I mean,
yeah. And it's C#.
Yeah, and it's C#. And it is very reactive, as I could see here. And so in this case, mm-hmm. and I'm jumping ahead because I do that.
No, that's fine.
This is Blazor on the server, and then mm-hmm. there's Blazor with WebAssembly.
Yep.
This is Blazor on the server still, right?
Yeah, but the code would be exactly the same.
The code is the same, but in Blazor on the server, it is using SignalR to basically pass packets back and forth, basically messages, little chunks. Yeah, little chunks basically to update the DOM. To basically do the rendering and any interactivity on the server side, and it passes it back. You're not having to do any API calls or anything.
Yep, that's right.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I would love to see what this looks like fully integrated, where you do have API endpoints and things like that within the application.
Sure.
Just because then you can really see all the extra stuff that you can cut out.
Yes, that's right.
Oh man.
So think about this. Bind :event on input. Every time mm-hmm. I enter a keystroke, mm-hmm. we are sending a message via SignalR to the server on every keystroke. Now, do you care? Do you want to see what that looks like?
I do.
All right.
I was hoping you'd open up F12. Yeah.
There you go. I'm going to do a Control F5.
All right.
And not a whole lot of data was transferred, about 433K uncompressed, 164K compressed, so not a whole lot. And this _Blazor right there is the WebSocket. And if I click on that, now you can see the messages. And I'm just going to clear them. And I'll go blah, like that. Okay? So take a look. Nice. 179 bytes up, 323 bytes back, 27 bytes to confirm.
And can you click on one of those? Let's click on that. Yep. Yeah. Okay, so that's what it goes on render co. Oh yeah, look at that.
Yeah.
It's like looking at a real application.
Yeah. Pretty cool, huh?
Yeah.
So not a lot of it, I guess it could be chatty if you're doing, every keystroke, but what the heck? That's what the internet's for. It's to get my data to you so you can bring it back to me. Okay, last minute thoughts before we wrap up this conversation?
Where do I sign up?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I know you want this.
This is really cool. Okay, in your honest opinion,
do
you think this is ready for prime time? Like, is this?
It is prime time.
It is prime
it's
time.
not only ready for prime time, it is being used in real scenarios. One scenario I can tell you it's being used right now is DevExpress, the sponsor of Blazor Train. If you go to their Blazor demos, that page is a Blazor application in production.
Okay, I'll have to check that out.
Yep. That's just
All
one.
right. Yeah, this is very cool. I mean, I have been kind of, well, number one, I've been really busy, so I don't really get a chance to play around with new stuff all the time, but
Yeah.
I do want to start diving into this, and I'm just waiting for the right opportunity.
And I think you're not alone, that there's a lot of
Yeah.
people out there who, especially those who have invested money and time in their teams in JavaScript technologies that, you know, are all of a sudden like, what? C# browser? What? Oh yeah, we might want to check that out when we get a free, you know, minute because it's time consuming developing. I mean, it doesn't matter what you're developing in, but you know, if you've invested all that time and money in Angular, let's say, or even React or Vue or anything, then nobody's saying you should jump ship, but check it out. Maybe there's ways that you can chisel pieces off and get them over to C# if that's what you want.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I'm really interested in your follow-up one about how do you start integrating this into an existing application? Because that's where I see an opportunity to do that with the project I'm working on.
Great.
And so that's where I would probably start and then do a side-by-side comparison.
Now, the project you're working on, does it use Vue?
Yes.
Okay.
So, but what I would do is have basically a new Blazor project. Yeah, now that I think about it, because it is a spa, I wouldn't really be able to take full advantage of Blazor, right? Because I don't have any back-end code in this particular project. All that is basically microservices that are running. And so this is more of a project. If I had a project that was more like an MVC type of web application.
Yeah. I mean,
actually, I do have I have another project in mind I could actually experiment with that I'm working on right now. That is an MVC application.
So what I'd like to see, and I think the viewers would like to see too, is like an existing Angular, you know, ASP.NET app that we could utilize, that we could build, you know, we could add Blazor to and sort of do what the Angular page does in Blazor, you know, side by side, different route, different URL. And you know, that would be a fun episode.
That would be. Yeah, I don't have any. Actually, I do. I have an old one that would fit the bill. Okay, I'll have to dig that up because that's the ideal kind of side-by-side comparison because you have that mix within the same project.
Yeah.
Of the Angular front end, and then you've got all the .NET backend stuff because that's really where you'll see the value.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I could see a lot of code being cut out, which is good. Like,
let's keep in touch, and we'll sign off for now, but we'll talk about that offline. Right. And Joel, thanks for letting me show you this.
Yeah, this is exciting. I had no idea.
Cool.
So I appreciate it.
I'll see you around.
All right. Thanks, Carl.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye-bye. I want to address Joel's question, and then I have something else for you. So his question was, can you have multiple events that trigger an update to a bound field? Well, let's try it. I'm going to run this with onChange as our primary event. In other words, that's the default event. And so when I tab off this, everything works just as it normally would. But now what he wants to do is something like this, where you have two events that can trigger and update to message. Let's see if it works. So on input certainly doesn't work, and if I tab off, on change doesn't work either. So I'm going to say that's a big fat no, at least with a comma syntax. So the documentation and out there on the internets, I couldn't find any examples of this. So again, I'm going to say no. But if anyone has ideas to the contrary or has discovered something that I don't know, please let me know. Now there's another thing that I want to show, and that is date formatting in a bound input field. So here you can see we've got a date, sample date, a date time, and we're binding the input to that sample date with a particular format, right? Now this bind : format syntax is really only available for dates right now. That's what the documentation says. You might want it for currency and other data types, but as of now, it's only for dates. So let's actually run this and see what happens here. All right, let's change this to tomorrow, August 3rd, or did I say August? Well, let's make it August. There we go. And let's make it next year. Fast forward to December 2022 and .NET 7, and Blazor's got some new features. So I'm going to start with the Blazor WebAssembly app empty template. This is new. I've never shown you this before, but it's basically a Blazor WebAssembly application that doesn't have counter and fetch data in it. Now, since this is the first time we've seen an empty Blazor project, take a look. I've got index and that's it. But more interestingly is the lack of bootstrap, right? And also check out main layout. It's not in a shared folder, and it's pretty simple. Nothing to it. And just to correct one thing that I said and to make it clear, when Joel asked me about what's the setup, what's the requirement for a Blazor application, the div named app and the script and the Blazor UI. Now, of course, you have to have these packages installed. You can optionally have an _imports razor. You have to have an app razor. And in program, you have to have the basic setup. But that's it. That's all you really need. Okay. I'm going to snap my fingers and bring this up to date where we left off with Joel. Snap. Okay. I've created a components folder for my components because I think that makes more sense than shared. So I put the child component in there, and this is the same child component that I was showing Joel. I've added a using statement in _imports razor for binding client components, and I've changed my index to show both the message demo with the child component and the date binding demo. Same as I had before in .NET Core 3.1. And this is what Blazor looks like without any styling. I hate this font. I got to change it. All right, so all I've done here is set the font to Candara and added a little padding. Looks better already. There we go. And there you go. All right, before I can show you the new binding features, we need something to bind. So I'm going to create the repository demo page where we have some customers and an in-memory repository. I'm going to go quickly, but if you want a detailed explanation of what I'm doing, go back and watch episode 76, Queryable Repositories. First thing I'm going to do is manage the NuGet packages for the entire solution, and I'm going to add 2 packages, Newtonsoft JSON to the client and the server, and then AVN repository, also to the client and the server projects. Now down in the shared project, I'm going to add a new class called customer. Remember this? ID, name, email. All right, now on the server side, we need a data folder, and we're going to add an in-memory repository. So this uses our iRepository interface from AVN repository. It's generic for any kind of entity. You pass in the ID property name. Then we have get async that takes a query filter, get all async, get by ID async, insert async, update async, and delete async. We also have delete by ID and delete all, just in case. All right, simple. Next, I'm going to go to the program CS on the server side. Right here at line 7, we're going to add that memory repository. So we've added it as a singleton, memory repository of customer, and we're passing ID as the name of the primary key. Now we need an API controller. So let's create a controllers folder on the server project and add in-memory customers controller. All right, so this guy injects a memory repository of customer, and then we expose the CRUD actions, easy peasy. All right, let's configure the client. Let's go to Program, and I'm going to add some global usings right to the top here. Next, I'm going to create a services folder and add an API repository. So this is a generic repository that uses an HTTP client to wrap calls to an API. You pass in the configured HTTP client, the controller name, and the primary key name. Now we can make a specific repository for the customer API. Remember this? The controller name is in-memory customers, and we pass that to the base, which is our API repository of customer. Pass the controller name and the name of the primary key, which is ID. Now we're going to go back to the client program, and right here, we're going to add that customer repository as a service. Now we're going to go back to _imports Razor and add a using statement for AVN repository. Now, rather than destroying our index page, which has a good demo on it, I'm going to create another page called search page. Now, this is the repository demo that I showed in episode 76. So that's where we're starting. Now, because we don't have a nav menu, I'm going to add a button to index to get us here. There it is right there. So all I'm doing is I'm calling the navigation manager, navigate to search page. All right, let's do it. Here's my search demo button, and here's search demo. So if you recall, what we can do is we can search by name by entering a search term here and then pressing the search button. And I have some options. Starts with is selected by default. So if I want to select Rocky or all of the records that start with R, I just type R and then I hit search. And if I want something that contains IS, it's Isadora, or how about ends with S? That just has these guys. And of course, I can be case sensitive. And I can also bring them back in a descending order. But all of these features require me to hit the search button. What I really want is for on every keystroke, this filter to be applied and for me to go get a new set of data. And that's what I can do with the new .NET 7 binding features. Let's check it out. So the search button calls this method search, and this uses a query filter that has a filter property name, and I pass the search filter, the operator, which is the filter option, starts with, ends with, contains, whatever, whether or not it's case sensitive. Okay, so all of these things are features of the query filter that I showed you in episode 76. I have a couple other options here that you can uncomment if you want to see how they work. All right, so that's my search method. First thing I'm going to do is get rid of this search button because we're not going to need it. Bye-bye. Now you see this input tag right here. All I've done is I've bound it to search filter. So that's my input. But there's a new thing that I can do in .NET 7, which is the @bind:\after tag. See that? Now don't mind the squiggles. Visual Studio is confused, but it's still going to run. Bind after says, okay, after the binding has been applied, which happens on an event, and on change is the default event, then we're going to call search automatically. Now, unchanged is the default event. So I have to, after I type, hit tab or otherwise lose focus. But what I want is for the binding to be triggered every time I press a key. So that is our old friend, @bind:\event equals on input. There we go. How about contains AR? Good. Contains A, contains S. They all contain S. How about case sensitive? That's cool, but that's not the only way that we can do this sort of instant binding. We can also use a get and set pair, bind:\get and bind:\set. This is a little bit more confusing, but I want to show you anyway. So the first thing we need is a method that we can bind as the setter. So I need two things here. I need to pass the search filter and I need to call search. So we're making this an async task method, and it's called setSearchFilterAsync. Okay. Now let's comment this guy out, because you still want to refer to that, and let's do it a different way. And yes, Visual Studio is still confused, but take a look at this. Bind:\get equals search filter. That's the value inside the input tag, just like the regular bind. But now we have a bind set, and we're setting that to setSearchFilterAsync. And it works exactly the same way. So what's the benefit? Well, I'm not really sure at this point. I guess the benefit in this case is we have a specific method that we call after, just like search, but it's an extra method, right? That sets the value and then calls search. So it's another level of indirection. Now, what if you want to completely encapsulate all this search stuff or this bind:\get and bind:\set stuff inside a component? You can do that. Let's add a component called searchbox. All right, so this is an input text type. Now I've added a couple of parameters here, one for class and one for style in case you want to set those externally. Also the bind event, we can specify that as well. By default, it's on input. Now the value is what we're binding to. And then we have a callback, value changed. And this is a convention with get and set. You have value and value changed, or X and X changed for the event callback. Our bind get is set to value. Our bind set is set to update, which raises the event. So now how do we use this? Let's go back to the search page. So we're going to comment this one out as well. So I have search box, I'm binding the value to search filter, and I bind value after to search. Not a whole lot of difference here, is there? But, you might want to do some other things in this component that you want to reuse. That's why we have a component, because right here you can do whatever you want. All right, let's see if there's any difference here. Works just as well. Now let's do one more thing. Let's add a little style, light green. Ta-da! Well, that's about it. Now, as far as the get and set, you're going to know when you need them. I'm just showing you how to use them. But there are some really good examples in the documentation. Search for ASP.NET Core Blazor data binding, and you'll find this page in the docs that has a lot more explanations and some good examples, like this. Now back to you in the studio, Carl. You know, it's really a wonderful thing when you can show something new to an experienced developer and they get it right away. You know, the long and short of it is, binding in the Blazor component model is so elegant and concise. I'm looking forward to many, many years of app development using Blazor and Visual Studio, and I hope you are too. Hey, thanks for riding the rails with me today. This is where I jump off. I'll see you next time. Blaze a train!